Good morning. My name is Lee, and my favorite ice cream is mocha. So I get to read the scripture to you today. This will be out of the book of Joshua, chapter 24. Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem and summoned the elders, the heads, the judges, and the officers of Israel. And they presented themselves before God. And Joshua said to all the people, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel. Long ago, your fathers lived beyond the Euphrates, Terah, the father of Abraham and of Norah, and they served other gods. When I took your father Abraham from beyond the river and led him through all the land of Canaan and made his offspring many, I gave him Isaac, and to Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau. And I gave Esau the hill country of Seir to possess, but Jacob and his children I sent down to Egypt. I sent Moses and Aaron, and I plagued Egypt with what I did in the midst of it, and afterward I brought you out. Then I brought your fathers out of Egypt, and you came to the sea, and the Egyptians pursued your fathers with chariots and horsemen to the Red Sea. And when they cried to the Lord, he put darkness between you and the Egyptians and made the sea come upon them and cover them. And your eyes saw what I did in Egypt. And you lived in the wilderness a long time. Then I brought you to the land of the Amorites, who lived on the other side of the Jordan. They fought with you, and I gave them into your hand. And you took possession of their land, and I destroyed them before you. Then Balak, the son of Zippor, the king of Moab, arose and fought against Israel. And he sent and invited Balaam, the son of Beor, to curse you. But I would not listen to Balaam. Instead, he blessed you. So I delivered you out of his hand. And you went over to the Jordan and came to Jericho. And the leaders of Jericho fought against you. And also the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, and I gave them into your hand. And I sent the hornet before you, which drove them out before you, the two kings of the Amorites. It was not by your sword or by your bow. I gave you a land on which you had not labored, and cities that you had not built, and you dwell in them. So eat the fruit of vineyards and olive orchards that you did, you eat the fruit of vineyards and olive orchards that you did not plant. Now therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you dwell. But alas, for me and my house, we will serve the Lord."
Thanks, Lee. Well, my name is Zack Thompson. I'm a pastor here at Calvary Bible Church, and this is summer. It's a time that we are in and out. We're in different places, myself included, as I've missed couple of the last couple Sundays over the last few weeks. And so it's good to remind ourselves as to what we are doing in the series. I want to look again at a promise that we looked at that God made to Abram before he renamed him to Abraham. This promise that was given all the way back in Genesis chapter 13. It says this. It says, "The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever." We'll stop there. God made this promise to Abraham that all this land that's around him, he would give to him. And Abraham lived in this land. But it was never his. He was itinerant. He would move to different places. He would constantly go back to one place, but he moved all throughout the land. It was never a place of security. It was never a place that was his to own entirely. But God had made this promise to him that this land would be for you and your offspring forever. It might start to bring about a question of, will God actually keep this promise? We looked at the life of Joseph, how through him God rescued his people. There was a famine in the land and they were able to be cared for and they were set up as a place to live, but not in this land. They're in Egypt. Then after a while, after about 400 years, things go bad in Egypt. They become slaves. So not only are they not in the place that God said would be theirs, but they're not living free. They're not able to live with their God. They're not able to worship him freely. Will God keep his promises? Well, God raises up a leader named Moses, and through him, the Israelites are rescued. They're brought out of slavery. They're brought out of Egypt, and they walk through the wilderness to the place that God had promised to them. And they're right about to enter. They're right up to the border, and Moses sends in these men, these spies, to go and see, is this land as good as God promised? They go in, and they come back, and they say, oh man, it's better than we possibly could have imagined. But it's occupied. There's these nations that live there, and they have these powerful armies. And it just leads to the people wailing in defeat before they've even gone in. Why did we come all this way? Why didn't we just stay? It was better for us when we were slaves in Egypt. We should have just stayed there. See, for them, it's clear that God's not going to keep his promises. Well, there's these two men, two of the spies, who don't respond that way. They say, no, God will be faithful. God will do what he says he was. We can go in. No one can oppose us with God with us. And the people respond with trying to kill them. These two men were Caleb and Joshua. See, throughout this series that we're calling By Faith, we're looking at how do imperfect people put their faith in the perfect God. But along the way, we have other examples that we see people who don't respond that way. We see people who turn away from God. Now, I'm not saying that these are people who merely have doubts. We all have times that we doubt. These aren't people who merely are afraid of their circumstances. We all are fearful of our circumstances. I mean, look at what the Israelites did. It wasn't just them saying, we don't think God will keep his promises. They were certain he could not. It wasn't just them saying, like, we're afraid to go and enter this land. It's God is not going to help us. To the point that they're willing to kill over that. This is hardened disbelief. This is not just saying God is not going to keep his promises, or questioning if God will keep his promises, but saying we know he won't. And so as a result of that, for them turning away from God, they don't enter into the land. They get what they thought was going to happen. God has them wander through the wilderness for 40 years. And it gets to the point that all of that generation that said God will not keep his promises, they all die off. And when we say that generation dies off, we do mean everyone. And that includes Moses, this leader that God had raised up. This one that God had worked through in so many incredible ways. The one that God said, Moses, you will lead this people into the promised land. And so there's got to be a question, right? If we've never had a leader like this, we've never had someone point us back to God like this, how can we possibly go in without him? How will God keep his promises without this leader to guide us there? What we see time and time again throughout the story of God faithfully working in Israel's history is what we see time and time again throughout the Bible. That God's promises don't fail when people do. That God's promises did not die when Moses did, but he always shows up. He is always faithful. God always keeps his promises. Well, this next generation is ready again. They are right on the edge of entering into the promised land. Will they follow in their forefathers' footsteps and say God will not keep his promises, or will they be faithful? And at this point, after this promise that we read that was given to Abraham, 700 years have passed, and now they're standing ready to enter. Can you imagine holding on to a promise for 700 years when it seems at times that it wasn't going to happen? How will they respond? Will they trust that God will keep his promises? Well, I would love to jump to the beginning of the book of Joshua chapter 1, to see this initial response. We're moving around into a few different places in the book of Joshua, so it'd be important to have the text in front of you, whether that's just on the screens or your own Bible, or we have Bibles that are in the back. And Joshua chapter 1 is on page 210 of the Bibles that we have in the back. But it's important to be seen that these words are coming from the Bible and not merely from my imaginations. We want to hear from God, less so from me. So Joshua chapter 1, starting at verse 2, says this. God is speaking. He says, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise. He's speaking to Joshua here. Go over this Jordan, the river that's the border of the promised land, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving to them, to the people of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, just as I promised to Moses. From the wilderness and this Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites to the great sea, towards the going down of the sun, shall be your territory. And no man will be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their fathers to give to them. We have this incredible promise, this incredible event that happens in the life of Joshua. He has seen this leader die before him, and now he's about to enter the promised land. And the greatest source of comfort that he could have, the greatest reminder is given to him here, and that is God is with him. In these times that we could doubt God's promises or question, is he even there? Is he going to do what he says he would? God faithfully shows up. And he reminds of what he said he will do. He reminds that he is with Joshua. He is showing him once again that all that I said I would do, I will do. And as a result of that, Joshua puts his trust that God will keep his promises. And the people put their trust that God will keep their promises. All except for one event that we see in chapter 7, where one person does not trust that God will keep his promises and does not think that God's plan is good for him, so he steps away to go after his own plan, and it leads to disaster. But apart from that, the people are fairly resolute in putting their trust that God will do everything that he says he will do. And they're doing so. I wonder sometimes if we are a bit unfair of the people in the Bible, especially the Old Testament, where they have God right in front of them, to think, well, of course they're going to put their faith in him. He's showing up. He's given very visible times. We're in a different category. We're in a different place. But when we see the Israelites in the book of Joshua put their faith in God, it's not always easy to do so. That even though, God's showing up and bringing victories for them, that even though God is guiding them in the way that they're going, even though God is reminding them of the promises, it is still so difficult, I can only imagine, to trust that God will do what he says he will do. There's a famous moment where the Israelites are going to go up to this fortified city called Jericho. And God says, I will give you this city. It's part of your possession. You will have this land. The city of Jericho was full of people who were committing atrocious sins, that were in rebellion against God, who heard all that God had done through the Israelites. So they had opportunity to repent, to turn towards him. We see some people actually do that, but they refused to do so. So God says, I will use you as a means of judgment on them, for they have gone against me. And so what does that mean if you're going to conquer a city but go into battle? So Joshua and all the Israelites are gearing up for battle, and God says, no fighting. Wait, how are we going to get the city then? How do we take possession of it? This is how we do it. If we don't take this city, then how will people know that you are the God who's given us victory? How will people know who you are if we don't take this place? If we just let them go on like this, they'll keep going away from you. God, we need to go into this battle in order to take it. And God says no. Instead, he gives them the most ridiculous plan possible. Go and walk around the city. Blow your trumpets for 7 days, and the walls will come crashing down. Well, the people put their trust in God, and that's exactly what happens. Because what does that show us? It shows us that it wasn't Israel. It wasn't their great armies. It wasn't their brilliant battle plans that they came up with that led to this victory. At the end of that, they have no recourse than to say, God did it. How else can you possibly explain it? All throughout the book of Joshua, again and again, it is reminding us that God is the one leading his people. That it isn't their ability that got them to this place. In fact, God says, if you are disobedient, I can take this land away from you as well and give it to someone who will be faithful. All throughout it, God is the one driving the story. God is the one keeping his promises. Well, that first victory tumbles into multiple others, and as we read at the end of the book, Israel eventually does take possession of the whole land. And right before that, there's this charge to the Israelites, this reminder to be faithful to this God who is so faithful to you, to turn towards him when he has done it all for them, this charge to them to be faithful. This is from Joshua 21 in page 231 of the Bibles that we have in the back. which I think just offers the key to understanding this whole book. It says, "Thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land that he swore to give to their fathers. And they took possession of it, and they settled there. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he swore to their fathers. Not one of all their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given all their enemies into their hands. Not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass." On the surface, the book of Joshua is about a variety of different things. It's about God bringing victory for his people, him alone being the one who's working. It's about God giving a home for his people, that he cares not just about the spiritual needs, but he takes care of the physical needs of his people, to give a place of security and safety and comfort. That God, it raised up another leader like Moses when it seemed like it was too hard to go forward without one. But at its whole, the story of Joshua is one about God keeping his promises. Look at that last verse again. Not one word of everything that God had promised had failed. Every single one of them came to pass. And this God who keeps his promises, the God of Joshua, the God of Israel, the God of the Bible, is our very God. And that's good news every single day. But it's especially good when we think about what we learn about God in this book. God keeps his promises. What are the things that God has promised you? What are the things that God has said is true for his people now? There are hundreds of promises God makes in the Bible. God promises salvation. And not just salvation that is possible, but it's secure, it's certain, no matter what. God promises that he is with his people. He will never leave us or forsake us, like he said to Joshua. God promises a way out of temptation and comfort in the midst of hardship. God promises rest and peace and provision. God promises that he is good and will do good for those who believe. God promises to return and make all things right, and we can go on and on and on and on again. What's that promise that you hold on to that God makes? All throughout the Bible, we see God make so many promises, and these are fantastic to read. I mean, where else in the world do you hear a single promise like this, let alone the whole avalanche of promises that God makes to his people? There is no other place that can give such a hope, such a blessing, such a future. There is nothing else, not a person or possession or position or place that can give as much meaning and significance as the promises that we find throughout the Bible. Now, if your mind works like mine does, that sort of becomes the problem. Because when we read about these verses, these verses that give us these promises, they sound fantastic. They sound like nothing like we see in the world. Well, that can start to make them sound fantastical, unrealistic. That's just not how the world works. I mean, can we really hold on to promises like this when we don't see this happening around us? I mean, it's nice to have a hope like this, but will God actually keep his promises? Do you trust in this God? Do you trust that he will do all that he says to you? And I don't just mean in the safety of a church gathering where we're supposed to give the good Christian answers. I mean, when things are good and bad, do you trust that God will do all this? When you wake up first thing in the morning, when you're trying to fall asleep and your brain starts working to fill the silence, when you're arguing with your spouse, struggling to know what to do with your kids, when work is hard or made hard for you, when you see someone you love suffering, when your pain becomes chronic, do you trust that God will keep all the promises that he makes? This is why I appreciate the book of Joshua. Because on the surface, it's a bit of a weird book. most of it is spent on dividing up the land amongst these other tribes. And while I recognize why it's there, I recognize why it's important, I'm not part of those tribes. I'm not part of this land, so it doesn't really jazz me up to know where the tribe of Dan is going to be located. When we read through what the Israelites are doing, it's hard to read some of these battle sequences. Or even just the way that they're living day to day. It feels so different than my day to day. But where I think Joshua is so impactful, so significant is because of where it is situated in the story. God has led his people up. They can see the promised land just on the other side. And they don't believe. But God faithfully shows up again and again and again, and eventually leads them right to this place that he had for them. In the midst of people who doubt, we see God show up. We see God keep his promises. We see a God who alone, who is working to do all that he says he will. And that God is the reason why we can hold on to these promises. Not as fantastical, not as unrealistic or unattainable. No, they are our certain future. See, just as the promised land became a homeland, it became their actual possession. What is promised to us by God will be our possession as well. You don't need to flip with me because we're flipping far, but it makes me think of 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 20. It says, for all the promises of God find their yes in him, Jesus. Find their fulfillment in him. And that is why through him, through Jesus, we utter our amen to God for his glory. Paul here is saying that all those promises that we read about, all those promises that we don't have time because we could fill a whole service just looking at what God has promised to us. All the promises of God are fulfilled in Jesus. All the promises of God we know are true, are kept because of Jesus. How do we know that God will actually do what he says he will do? Because he's already done it. He sent his son. How do we know that we truly have a future? Because that future has been put in place because Jesus has already come here. How do we know that things will be made right? Because we have been made right with our God through Jesus. See, because of Jesus, everything that we could possibly long for, we don't have to hope. We don't have to blindly trust that it might happen. We can know it will happen because God's already put it in place. Every promise of God finds its yes in Jesus. All throughout the book of Joshua, we see God keep his promises. All throughout our lives, we see God keeps his promises. And that is what helps us to live our lives in response to him. I love that call of Joshua that we read about in chapter 1. Where God begins saying, here's what I'm doing. I'm going to do this like I'm going to keep my promise in this way. I'm showing up. I'm telling you that I'm with you. I'm not going to leave you or forsake you. God is listing out everything that he will do for Joshua. And then you get this verse after that. So be strong and courageous. That order is so important. We oftentimes try to flip that around of God just tells us we got to buck up. We got to work harder. We got to prove to him our worth. We got to put forth our effort. God says be strong and courageous. And we miss the fact that everything before that said, I'm with you. I will not leave you. I'm the one going ahead of you. I will keep my promises. I'm doing everything. So in response to that, you can be strong. You can be courageous. Our lives are shaped when we realize that God is the God who keeps his promises. And we live in response to all that. But the other side of the story is we see the negative example of that as well. We see what happens when people do not respond with faithfulness to the faithful God. I mentioned in chapter 7 that there's the one setback in the story where there's this man named Achan, where he does not trust that God will keep his promises. He doesn't think that God will meet his needs. He doesn't trust that God will be the one who gives him this future. So he gets greedy. He tries to take matters into his own hands, to come up with his own plan. And in doing so, he avoids God's plan. Now, I don't know if I'm the only one on this, but that sure seems to describe just about every single one of my weeks. Yes, God, I know you have been faithful. Yes, God, I know you've shown up. Yes, God, I know you've done the most remarkable thing, the most beautiful thing possible by sending your son. But I don't know that you're going to help me with my calendar this week. I'm not sure you understand the pressures that I'm facing. I'm having a hard time believing that what you have planned for me is truly good. And so I'll just do it myself. And just like what happens in chapter 7 in Achan, it leads to disaster. And so for people like me, who think that I am the one driving my life, who think that unless if I have the control over the situation, it's going to fall apart. For people like me, for people like Achan, the only possible response is surrendering to the God who keeps his promises. To trust that what he is doing is sufficient and more than what I could possibly do. That he is the one truly working. That when we try to wrestle control away from him, that leaves us fighting on our own and not with the God who brings about victory himself. And so what do we need to release this week? What have we been trying to hoard for ourselves? Trying to hide away from God? Trying to take control of, work out of our own power and strength, even though we know that's failed in the past, but this time, I have a good feeling about this time. Where are we not trusting in his promises? See, we have the positive example of God promising of what he will do, but we also see how this explodes for when we don't trust in those promises. When unfaithful people doubt the ever-faithful God. So let us be people who rest solely in his promises. Now, for others in this room, it might not be pride or self-sufficiency that leads to us to doubt. It could be fear. It could be questions that we have. It could be obstacles that are put in our place. There's things that emerge in life that make it hard to trust in God. There's questions that come that make us wonder, is God truly good? Sometimes it's just hard to see what he has for us when things are so hard. I promised myself when I was going to preach through Joshua, I wasn't going to go to this passage, and I definitely do not have the time to make this point, but one of my favorite stories in the entire Bible is in the book of Joshua. In chapter 4, the people finally enter into the promised land. 700 years after the promise was first made to Abraham, you will have all this land. Finally, they set foot in the land that God had said to them. And the very second that they do so, God gives them an instruction. In order for them to cross in the land, God stopped the water of this river that was there, the River Jordan. And as they were walking through it, God gave them an instruction to gather stones, 12 of them, one for each of the tribes that were there. And he also explains why he was having them pick up these rocks. It wasn't so they could build an altar. It wasn't for them to hold a worship service saying God had kept his promise. It wasn't for them to do sacrifices or say, God, you truly did it. God says, no, I don't need any of that. You need something. And I'm going to give you what you need in this time. This is Joshua chapter 4, at the very end of it. Starting in verse 19. It says, the people came up out of the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and they encamped at Gilgal at the east border of Jericho. And those 12 stones, which they took out of the Jordan, Joshua set up at Gilgal. And he said to the people of Israel, when your children ask their fathers in times to come, what do these stones mean? Then you shall let your children know Israel passed over this Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the water of the Jordan for you until you passed over, as the Lord your God did at the Red Sea when he dried up for us until we passed over. So that all the people of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, that you may fear the Lord your God forever. I used to bring up this passage all the time when I was a kids pastor because it's such a great picture of leaving this legacy of faith, of pointing people back to God. But I missed how impactful it is, not just for kids, but for everybody. For the nation that's assembled, for the people who weren't there that day, for all that who can look in on what God was doing in Israel and come up with the same conclusion. Here is a God who keeps his promises. And until the day that we see him face to face, you and I will struggle to believe that every single day of our lives. And so how do we cast out doubts? How do we cast out self-reliance? How do we trust in his promises if that's going to be the case? Only with constant reminders. is why we are people who gather here on Sunday and go straight to the Word of God so that we could be reminded of what we've forgotten in this past week. It is why we are people who read the Bible, not just on Sundays, but all throughout our life. We constantly want to go back to what has God said? What has God said? So that we can remind ourselves that he will keep his promises. I encourage you, or what's slightly less than beg? I slightly less than beg you at some point this week, read through the book of Joshua, and not to accomplish it. I was asked to do this. I can check that off. I've completed my part. No, what we see in this book are reminders that God keeps his promises, and you and I are desperate for those reminders. But I also think about this passage and how God does not just give instructions to individuals, but to the whole. He called for the whole nation to stack these stones. He called for the whole nation to make known what God had done this day. He called for the whole nation to help each other to remember that God does not leave us on our own in isolation trying to figure out what God is up to. He gives us one of the greatest gifts that there is, and that's each other. See, when we gather here on Sunday, it's as if there's dozens of stacked stones here for us to help remind us that we have a mighty God, to help propel us to be people of faith. See, when we walk in this room, we're not just around people that we sing songs next to. When I'm with you all, it's not just with a group of people that I occasionally put to sleep once a week. When we are here as a church, we have constant reminders of God's constant faithfulness in each other's lives. See, as we know the people that God has brought together in this church, when we know the stories of what God has done in their life, that is a reminder for us that we have a faithful God. Then we look around at people who have gone through hardships and difficulties and struggles, who have had plenty of time to say God will not keep his promises, and yet be shown time and time again that God keeps his promises. That's not just your story. That's not just my story, but those are visible displays to all of us that we have a God who keeps his promises. And so when we walk out of here, I can think of, oh, man, I saw Grace today, and I know how God's been faithful to her. Oh, I saw Angelo today, and I know how God's been faithful to him. And that is the reminder as I go out into this next week that I'm not going by myself. I'm not going to have to struggle through what is in front of me. I have the God who's been faithful to each and every one of us, so I know I have the God who's going to be faithful to me. We have a God who keeps his promises, but he also gives us one of the most beautiful things that there is, the most needed thing that we have, and that's constant reminders of his constant faithfulness.
Thanks for joining us for our series By Faith. If you found this video helpful, click the like button and subscribe to our channel. It helps more people discover resources like this from Calvary Bible Church. You can learn more about us at calvarybible.com, and we look forward to seeing you again next week.